who is currently the Marine Conservation Initiative lead for the board and a Moore Foundation. And in case there's anybody in the room who doesn't know the Moore Foundation, or Packard Foundation, or Sloan Foundation, or Pew, or Hewlett, or Gates Foundation, they collectively hand out a whole heck of a lot of money, and in that way, and in other ways, direct what we do, how we think about things environmental and sustainable, and hopefully help to shape the solutions that are on the cusp of becoming reality. So, Barry started in the same place that many of us did, in a place that had a good local environmental sense, on a farm in New York, in this case. And so, grew up in that environment, filtered through the ocean filter that many of us senior people went through. That would be Jacques Cousteau. And so gained a love of things marine. And eventually that channeled him into science. He has a set of degrees, about 4 of them. All of the standard degrees that you like to have as a scientist through a doctorate. Went on to be a doer in science. Many of us, in fact, in the academic and agency environments, are that doers of science, and the students are on the edge of thinking about it and wanting to be a doer. And being a doer is a good thing, but it's not the only thing in science. You can also be a user of science. In fact, there are many more users than there are doers of science. And Barry has also done that since with the Department of the Interior, with the House, with the National Academy, and also with AAAS, and has some very interesting stories about other legislators and representatives of the federal government and how they are seen by everybody else in Washington. We're not depending on how high you are when you do it, right? But being a doer and being a user are not the only things. In fact, you can be an enabler. You can be somebody who makes a decision that you can have a far greater reach and impact by trying to facilitate what's going to happen in science and push the middle out to the edge and really make a difference. And really, I think that that's one of the things that has come out of the environmental foundations, especially in the last 15 years. They have stepped up and said, we're not going to just sit in back rooms and hand out money. We're actually going to say something about what we want to see happen. And so that's actually the task that I charged Barry with, to come tell us about the role of environmental foundations in shaping, creating, maintaining sustainable fisheries. So we started out, I have to say, with the talk title, 11 Points and Incentives in Shaping Sustainable Fisheries, the Role of Environmental Foundations. And that's gotten more over time to the role of one foundation, in fact, the foundation that works with, in marine conservation. So cool.
Thank you, Julia. Can everybody hear me? So it is a real privilege and honor to be here. In my own career, I was shaped by many of the people who have taught here and who have graduated here. Going back to how I probably ended up getting into policy was reading some of that young stuff. So along history and tied at the University of Washington, and it's a privilege that this is my first opportunity to come here and visit. I changed the talk because it's hard to speak about all foundations. And so I want to start with a disclaimer. And the disclaimer is something that was told to me by a senior foundation program officer, which is once you know one foundation, you only know one foundation. We're all unique in how we operate and somewhat idiosyncratic. And I wanted use the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation as a lens in philanthropy. And I do see Moore, having had the privilege of working at the Packard Foundation and also serving on the board of an organization that crosses many foundations. But really, I'm going to speak from the position of the Moore Foundation, and during Q&A, I can try to broaden that out. So the Moore Foundation was founded by Gordon and Betty Moore. Gordon is the co-founder of Intel, and before that, Fairchild Semiconductor. And when I first joined the foundation, I interviewed Gordon because I wanted to know whether or not to take the job. What kind of leeway was I going to have? There was a guy that has created so much in the world, and what did he expect of us, and what could I get from him in return? And we had an interesting interview, and Gordon said, you know, we founded Fairchild in the 60s, and everybody was out creating revolutions. He said, but in the end, I think those of us who were thinking about the integrated circuit, creating the microchip, may have created the biggest revolution in society. So I want you to think about the work that we do at the foundation as revolutionary and not evolutionary. That was a pretty big charge, and I said, well, Gordon, so how do we do this? And he goes, no, I don't know how to do any of that. That's why we hire you guys. It's founded in September of 2000, so we're young. We're just entering our 10th year. We're not even into adolescence yet. We were originally in the Presidio. We're now in Palo Alto. We have 3 program areas. Just to give you a sense, our endowment is about $5 billion. You're required by the IRS to pay out a minimum of 5% a year, so we give out about $250 million in grants. We have 75 employees. So far, we've awarded 800 grants through December of 2009. The total value of that is about $1.8 billion, and the payout so far is $1.6. So a reasonable amount of money. Here's the programs: environmental conservation, science in the San Francisco Bay Area. One theme that I hope you'll notice is an ocean theme. We have a wild salmon ecosystems program, a marine conservation program, and a marine microbiology program. The reason for that is that the Moors have an interest in the oceans. And so that's one of the things that we're focusing on. A little bit about our approach, and this is where foundations start to distinguish themselves. There's one end which is what I would call pure charity or cause-based. That is, you like something and you provide your money. There's another end of the spectrum of the way philanthropy operates, which is very directed and strategic, and some people describe it as democratic. And the Moore Foundation is more on that end of the spectrum. So we start with doing strategic planning. The plan that we developed for the initiative that I'm now running, the Marine Conservation Initiative, I think it runs about 150 pages. We have about 170 citations, 80 personal communications. My staff probably interviewed many of you in this room. We interviewed a whole bunch of people. And then we spent 6 months really putting together a strategy that we thought if we executed on it could make a difference. And then we started testing it. The foundation is very concerned about avoiding mission creep, so we're one of the more focused foundations. We're pretty narrow in what we do. And they don't want to be fickle. We're not flitting from topic to topic. Once we invest in the topic, we try to stay with it for a while. We work through what many foundations now do, these things called theories of change or a logic model. When I first saw them, I thought, oh, this is great, an easy way to rationalize what you're doing. At the Moore Foundation, we make them science-based. And by that I mean, embedded in our theory of change is a hypothesis. If you do A, B will happen. You can measure the change, and you can measure it. You can see whether or not you're having an impact. We try to work at scale. As we try to be large enough that we can make a difference, but small enough that we can actually see that what we're doing is having an effect. And our goal is to be durable in the changes. So there are certain solutions that we would take off the table, because the only way you're going to have those solutions continue is if you continue to support them. And we're not interested in that. After some period of time, we want to leave and move money elsewhere, but have that social change be durable. In finding people to work with, it's critical that we find alignment. So what we try to do is understand the capacity of the various organizations, whether it's an NGO, an academic unit, or a governmental organization, And then if we think they've got the capacity and they have the interest in partnering with us, is there really alignment? And if there's alignment, then we work together. As I say, and this was Gordon, we don't take unsolicited proposals, but we take lots of unsolicited ideas. So feel free to come up and talk to me. We just try to weave them into our own sort of fabric of what we're going to do. I've already said this, but I want to reiterate it because it's the one touchstone that we have. If we talk to, people try to build common cultures and organizations. If you talk to anybody at the Moore Foundation about how we work, they'll say, oh, we use the 4 filters. These were something that was developed by Gordon in the first year of the foundation. We were trying to figure out how to get the first large tranche of money out the door. So in order for us to work on something, it's got to be important. And that importance is important to us. So not necessarily the most important thing in the world, but something that we think is important. We've got to be able to make a significant difference. Gordon isn't interested in sort of just changing something slightly and having the problem continue. The challenge is to fundamentally change the way something works. Have it be enduring and have it be measurable. If you look at our website, we look like a random collection of activities, and to some extent we are. But we've looked at a lot of things that we decided not to invest in. And we decided not to invest in because it didn't fit one of these first 3 filters typically. A good example was we had a fairly large investigation into cities, the problems of urbanization. When we look at environmental problems in the future, urbanization is a huge issue. We actually designed an entire strategy. It was going to run about 30 years. We granted $9 million. And then, it was one of Gordon's top priorities. And then we tried to start thinking about how we were going to measure our impact. We couldn't find a way to measure it. And so the decision was made not to continue the investment. So we take these filters pretty important. And this is, each of our strategies is a suite of grants meant to come at the problem from different angles. And sometimes we're trying to create the pressure to drive people towards a solution space. In other places, we're trying to create the solution. In other cases, we're trying to develop the information that we're going to need to even understand and think about the problem. So we use different models and think through for ourselves models of how social change happens. There's no citations on these. I don't know if we've stolen from the literature. It's sort of what we've developed at the foundation over time. Hopefully they have some merit, and for the social scientists out here, you'll say, yeah, that's probably the way it works, but I can't guarantee it, but it's the way we think about it. So one way to get social change is to just purchase the result. So if you're a foundation and you've got money, one way to get social change is to purchase the result. Create a land deal. You want to lock up land, buy it, buy the easement, do something. Pretty direct transaction. Doesn't take a lot to get it done. A second way to do it is to educate a decision maker. To get someone in the power of making the decision to have the information that you want them to have. As foundations, we're prohibited from lobbying. We violate our tax code, so we educate. And we work with other people to have them educate in a way that's influential. Now, once you start getting into that space, it's not just governments that you're going to influence, there are private actors. And we can do that either, again, through a policy lever, or we might want to do it by creating incentives, market campaigns. And a good example is the campaign that people started and supported at Home Depot to carry certified lumber. We made it appear as if there was an economic impediment for them to carry certified lumber. In fact, I think probably it's not true, but it's worked. So. Then there are key influencers, the people that we all listen to, right? Who are people that we listen to that might influence us? And so if we can get them the information, they can have impact on government actors. So sometimes we're working back at this space, educating consumers or grassroots organizers. Key to all of this, from our perspective, is making sure people have the right information. So we have to develop the scientific information. We support studies. We support often synthesis of studies. We don't do a lot of primary research. That's already out there. And quite frankly, relative, even though we're a fairly large foundation, relative to the amount of money that's out there in the government sector and other sectors, we're really small change. And then we build capacity. One of the places is in civil society is the environmental NGOs, the non-governmental organizations. We try to support those groups so that they can be active partners and help us in some of these other areas. So this is one of the models. There's another model of how to foster social change, and that is by, again, a services. It's a sort of this is the direct mode. You can buy something or pay for something. Not much durability here, because when you leave, the service is gone. You can affect beliefs, and that's some of what we do in that first model, but some people just stop here, right? There's foundations that all they do is fund campaigns to shape ideas and just hope that those beliefs will take hold and have influence. Or you can change the rules of the game, and this is where you are either using markets or legislation or policy. And we try to do a combination of these. We don't do this third one over here. So, just to summarize before I move into the next part, is that all foundations are different. But I think what we're seeing is everyone today is about impact. All foundations want to maximize the impact of the dollars they spend. So everybody's trying to measure what effect they're having. We've got this whole language around outcomes and wanting to see real change. We're fortunate that we tend to be, our initiatives in general range from about 8 to 10 years in what we call the first authorization, and they, for the most part, have been built with a 20 to 30 year time frame. And our scales are pretty large. We're working at, for example, the scale that Andy's Amazon Basin, that initiative, the goal of that initiative is to protect enough of the rainforest canopy that we can maintain rainforest dynamics, and by our estimates and our modeling work, that's about 70% of the canopy. That's a pretty ambitious goal to undertake. And we recognize that any success that we have is due to the work of our partners. It's great we can put all these ideas together, but unless we can find the right academic, NGO, and governmental partners to work with, we really can't make much happen. So I'm going to talk to you now, take and use marine conservation as an example of how we work. So I joined the Moore Foundation in 2005. And when we started, I would say, it's a little bit of a caricature. But if you thought about what was marine conservation in 2005, it was marine protected areas, and it was command and control management. When we took a look at it, we thought, you know what? Marine protected areas actually don't equal marine conservation. And if you look at the state of fisheries, we're not really accomplishing much. So what else do we need to do? So we developed something at the time that we called area-based management. We're now calling it, what you see in the next slide, we now call it marine spatial planning. But it was the idea that marine protected areas aren't enough because they set up an adversarial conversation in which winners and losers. And plus you're protecting one little space and you're not sure what the other contiguous uses or competing uses are that you might want there. So we wanted to look at this in a more holistic framework, and I'll talk about that later on in the talk. We looked at fisheries management and we wanted to change the incentives. So the first thing we did was we made an investment in something that back then was called dedicated access privileges. We now talk about it as catch shares. So we decided we were going to try to move fisheries management to catch shares, scientifically based catch limits, more sustainable fishing gear, and adequate monitoring. And the overall theme for us is that when we talk about ecosystems, we need to make people part of the system. And that in the end, our larger goal is to get healthy ecosystems for a healthy economy. That these are complex socio-ecological systems, so we can't approach them just from the point of view of biological science. We have to deal with social and economic science. That people are both part of the problem and part of the solution. We coined this phrase pragmatic environmentalism. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what it means, and it influences the kind of strategies that we undertake. We're very strong on the idea of ecosystem services and how that whole frame might be advanced and impacted and get us conservation at scale. And we're also really, really interested in climate change, so we're not investing in it directly, but it's created a space for us to operate in. And some of the things we are exploring are issues of adaptation and So when we started, these were the major threats. Everybody's seen them. They've been articulated over and over again. If you read the major reports that came out at the end of the 1990s and early 2000s, everybody had the same threats. And then we sort of continue to beat ourselves over the heads, right? So this is Ben Halper's work. We have to show that we're actually having this negative impact on the oceans. So if we came down and said, look at all of those threats, and what were the ones that were the greatest? And we thought overfishing and habitat alteration were the greatest threats. And partly it's the greatest threats, but it's also what were the ones that we could do something about. So it's a great threat out there, but we didn't see a way to address it. We took it off the table initially. And so then we wanted to find a way to get to tractable solutions. And as I said, our model is to unite science, political momentum, and incentive-based approaches. And so that led to the Marine Conservation Initiative. We stepped down that healthy ecosystems for healthy communities goal to measurable, you'll see the words in our mantras, measurable progress towards resilient and productive marine ecosystems in North America, managed sustainably for current and future generations. These words, resilient and productive, we spent about a month on. And they're really important for us at the Foundation and probably lost to everybody else. Resilient is we want to recognize that these systems are going to change over time. So for us to try to identify some static endpoint and say we were going to get there just wasn't what we were going to be about. We were going to allow these systems to be used. They were going to change over time anyhow. So we had to recognize that they were dynamic. Productive is that they had to provide benefits to people. We couldn't just lock them away, and if there was no benefit, we didn't see a way to get to durability. I've already told you our two core strategies, reforming fisheries management, which we've now changed to marine spatial planning. And then another look at our theory of change, laid out in a more measurable fashion. So the investigation phase is where we start to craft what the conservation solutions are. Our theory is that if we can craft a solution, we can demonstrate it, we can get it put in place, that's going to lead to a behavioral change. Behavioral change leads to the conservation outcomes, and all along the way, we've got to support the environment that creates the conditions for that change to happen. So the way we do this is we start with a science-based assessment. So in both our reforming fisheries management and our marine spatial planning, we supported studies. So the first study was a study done by Redstone Consulting, Environmental Defense Fund, that looked at catch-share programs around the world. And I'll show you some of that later on. We convinced ourselves that it was a meaningful approach. The data supported the fact that if we could get them implemented, we could see the change in fisheries management that we wanted. Then we moved into supporting regional examples. Those regional examples we modify. So we use places as our experimental laboratories. We adaptively manage them as we're going forward. We try to create model programs. And hopefully, if you can create model programs, you're getting the support of constituency. That constituency helps diffuse the idea to a broader scale. It also helps drive policy change, and that's how we get durability. So where do we work? We picked a few places, because remember I said the Foundation wants us to be focused. So we went and we found places that either had conditions for change. So British Columbia already had a law about marine spatial planning. The West Coast was doing great in fisheries management. Or because things were so bad in New England, people might be interested in trying to make a change. And the theory is that if we can get, especially marine spatial planning, our goal is to get the entire EEZ of the United States and Canada engaged in some form of marine spatial planning. We'll have a fairly large impact on the ocean space. Remember, we're doing it by just working in a few small places and then trying to diffuse it out. So I want to show you what one of these looks like. They're fairly complicated. There's data behind each of these. We've argued these through with a series of experts. And this would be pretty hard to monitor and measure, right? Because I told you that we're all about measurement. So we moved them into more simplified diagrams. We've helped support the large environmental organizations to develop something called the Common Measures Partnership. So there's a whole talk to WWF or the Nature Conservancy or Conservation International. There's a whole framework and set of tools now, software tools, where you can build this. We actually identify the conservation outcome. We put it down. So, we want to see pelagic fish, mammals, forage fish, ground fish. We have measures for each of these. We have our sense of what the behavioral outcome is that gets there. We have a sense of what the conservation solutions are that we're putting in place. And then this is the areas where we're grant making, and if I showed it to you at another level of detail, we actually tie each grant to the set of activities that it's meant to influence. So we know when we're evaluated or when we're looking at our program 3 years, is this investment an investment we're going to continue? Is it actually having the impact that we thought? Or do we have to change it? And that's part of the reason that we have to have alignment and strategic partnerships with our grantees. Because we may change the work. If it's not producing the results, we're not going to continue the grant. And I don't know if any of you are in the grant receiving business, but we are one of the foundations that stops grants mid-course. We do take our money back. We do shut programs down. And that's somewhat unusual, but it's because we're always measuring where we're going and what we're trying to produce. I told you a little bit about this strategy. One of the elements that we've added as we built it, and it's based on some studies that we did, is we're trying to look at the durability on informing fisheries management and getting catch shares in place. And for those of you who are following it, there's now some national policies on it. We've made a lot of progress. We're still challenged with implementation in New England and along the Pacific West Coast. One of the things we found is that if these things get implemented and they're executed as we think they can be, they will create economic rent. And we can use that economic rent, especially at a time when we have a government that has less than a robust budget, to pay for the operation and maintenance, essentially the management cost of that natural capital, so that we can sustain fishery going forward. Here's where we started. When we started in 2005, there was one catch share program in the Northeast and one along the West Coast. Today, we've got the no-aid administrators committing to support catch shares. We've got $35 million in new federal funds. We've got a catch share design manual that would allow anybody who wants, any of the fishing councils, to go out and start designing some of their own. We've got 18 sectors looking for catch shares in New England. So New England has gone from a place where there was a moratorium against moving to this kind of fisheries management, getting ready to put their largest and most complex fishery into a catch shares management system. We've seen similar change in the Pacific West Coast. And I don't want to suggest that this has been easy or that we are anywhere near success. I've got a graph at the end, and what it turns out, as you move from theory to practice, the resolve of the people whose change you're trying to make stiffens, and it gets harder to actually get them over the last 10% hurdle. One of the things that we had to do along the way was differentiate the types of catch share programs so that we could design them in response to the kind of socio-cultural aspects of the fishery. When we first started, we were all about one size fits all. And this is a slide that I added from having talked to a number of you this morning, just to let you know that we did think about the socio-cultural aspects. We could go back and redesign and think about how we can. I told you we did the study. We got a lot of great results. It's led to additional work, some of which we've supported, some of which we haven't. This shows where catch shares sit now in the U.S. There's more of them happening. And as I said, we're now seeing change in America's largest fisheries. And our belief is that if this draft catch shares policy that's been put forward by the federal government is adopted and enacted, we will see fisheries managed very differently across the U.S. And as a result, we'll have much more sustainable fisheries. And the foundation is now getting asked if we'd be interested in going in and working in Mexico and Latin America on similar kinds of programs. And quite frankly, we don't have the resources. We have the interest, but we don't have the resources because we have them tied up in these large-scale programs. So what about marine spatial planning? Here we're trying to create a move from single-species management to ecosystem-based management, from ignoring cumulative impacts to accounting for them, From having a set of MPAs and a sea of degradation all around it, to have MPAs in a broader framework with multiple use zones that hopefully actually enhance the MPAs themselves. Moving from a piecemeal and siloed approach to a comprehensive and integrated approach, and getting out of the user conflict space, having people come to the table. They're still going to fight it, right? Because there's still something in it from the end, but it changes the nature of the conversation and dynamic. We've seen this program go even faster than we had anticipated, and so one of our challenges now is catching up with what's happened here. As I told you, we designed the strategies. We're in adaptive management on our marine spatial planning strategy. Our original theory was we would start up in British Columbia because they already had a law and get that marine spatial plan in place. Massachusetts, where we were doing some work to create a law, would follow behind. And then California, where we were already working on a network of marine protected areas that we were going to expand out into more robust marine spatial planning, would fall somewhere along there. And then with these three examples, we'd be able to convince the federal government to think about marine spatial planning. Well, things don't always happen the way we plan them. So we still don't have a marine spatial plan in British Columbia. What we have is First Nations working on their plans, and we have the federal and provincial government grudgingly now coming to the table and signing an MOU with us to get started. Massachusetts passed their legislation far faster than we had anticipated, and instead of following our advice and taking 3 years to develop their plan, they decided to do it in 18 months. And so in January they signed they're the first state with comprehensive marine spatial planning in state waters. And in California, we're still working our way through the Marine Life Protection Act initiative and trying to build support for marine spatial planning. We also supported work at UNESCO to look across the globe at who was doing marine spatial planning, which led to a set of best practices. And with the new Obama administration coming in, and you remember all of the talk during the campaign when we had $4 a gallon gas and we had the moratorium on oil and gas exploration expiring, we have both presidential candidates and many congressmen talking about allowing oil and gas exploration in the Outer Continental Shelf. We just heard that reaffirmed in the State of the Union address. So we're not likely to see the Congress reinstate the moratorium. So oil and gas exploration is a threat. Massachusetts being a model, and UNESCO tying a set of best practices. Out of those three pieces, and having the right people in the administration, we have the administration in December of last year issuing an interim framework for coastal and marine spatial planning. So jumping way ahead of us in terms of our being able to develop our models or get our tools in place. Nonetheless, we think the lessons that we've learned in the Massachusetts case, we're going to be able to bring to the national level, as well as, so we've now finally gotten the British Columbia on board, and we've got to catch up with what's happening at the national level. Beyond that, we also, as Julie said, so we make the majority, I would say 80% of our funding in these initiatives. But we also make other grants. We make cross-cutting grants, which are trying to work across various areas of the foundation, trying to help fill in the gaps. Examples of these would be we're funding work on the Atlantis model. And it's a modeling framework that's ecosystem-based with fisheries and spatial management, developed first in Australia. We made that grant to the Northwest Fisheries Science Center. And I remember when I put that grant through, Gordon Moore sent me an email. I was reading the grant. He goes, "Tell me why I'm voluntarily giving my money to the federal government." So I emailed him back. I said, "Gordon, we went to the people who were absolutely best at it. And by the way, if they develop it, the managers are more likely to use it." He emailed back, "Great, I approve." So we do fund government, which is not always usual. We've also worked on strategic communications. One of the things that we saw was that a lot of the NGOs we fund were not as successful as we would have liked with their campaign. We're trying to drive their idea home. So we brought together a bunch of professionals, people who had managed political campaigns, electoral campaigns, ballot initiatives. We said, how do you do campaign planning? And we worked with a strategic communications firm And the challenge I gave them was, what was out there was you could find a 1,000-page campaign manual or all sorts of scattered resources on the web. And I said, I want a 20-page book that would take anybody and make them an expert campaign planner. We got it down to 40 pages. It's Just Enough Campaign Planning Guide. It's on the website. You can Google it. It's been picked up by 10,000 people. So we try to enable people, give them skill sets that they don't have. And we also work on policy. Here's a picture of the campaign planning guide. We also do exploratory grant writing, where we sort of pick up an idea that you've had, we try to move it forward a little bit to the next level to see if there's more traction there for us. And two examples of that, we have a grant around adaptation to climate change with a group called EcoAdapt. And they were trying to build a community of practice, if you will, around people who are working on adaptation to climate change in marine systems. We're not sure where we're going to take it, whether we can even go a next step. So we made an initial grant to try to pull that together. And Matt mentioned ecosystem services. We are really, really excited about the opportunity that ecosystem services has to transform the way we think about and do conservation. And so we funded the Natural Capital Project to take the work that they've done around their INVEST tool, which is focused on the terrestrial realm, and bring it into the marine environment with a new set of modules called Marine INVEST. So lots of, we report all the time, lots of progress, lots of things that we've done, working with different people. And for us, it feels like we're at a point where there are some really world-changing ideas on the table. And for marine sciences, marine affairs, marine conservation, it's really a new golden age. And this was the December issue of Scientific American. And it was the first time they identified world-changing ideas in 5 areas: in environment, energy, transportation, technology, and I can't remember the 5th. And marine spatial planning was their world-changing idea for the environment. So they've highlighted as something that, can really make a difference. We work with lots of great partners, and I think if I would, the opportunity that I would leave you with is if we can be successful at taking the ecosystem services framework so that people really think about how they have to sustain the natural capital that provides many of the support services and partner that with physical capital and use frameworks like marine spatial planning so you can think about the sustainable wealth that you're creating in the oceans and look at the highest and best set of uses in sort of a portfolio analysis. We can actually make conservation become part of the mainstream and maybe not have to talk about having environmental foundations. When I first worked up on Capitol Hill, the first speech I wrote for the chairman of the House Science Committee was on a set of environmental issues. And he handed it back to me and he said, we really have to change this. He said, as long as environment is set out there as a special interest, it is always going to be secondary and lower level any other policy frame we have. We have to figure out how to change it. That was in 1984. So here we are in 2010, and I'm hopeful that ecosystem services, which is not a new idea, but an idea which is becoming more robust, might give us that lens so that we can embed conservation in almost every decision that's made. And once we mainstream environment, I think we'll be much farther ahead of the game. And that's one of the bigger change issues that we're trying to drive at as a foundation. The team worked with a great group of people. One of your own, Kate Wing, graduated from Marine Affairs, then went and did a NOWS Fellowship, then went to the Heinz Center for Science and Policy, NRPC, now working with us. And many of the ideas in this talk are theirs, as well as many of you who I've talked to. So thanks very much. So you sound like,
your sense of measurement.
right. So we had the foundation I didn't talk about, we have an active evaluation program. And in 2009, we had what we call an external initiative evaluation. It was done by a consultant who specialized in evaluation and a set of experts in the field. The expert panel was chaired by Mike Warlock from Duke University. And Gordon Moore asked them that very, because they presented the results, and they said, can you tell us, is the foundation 2% or 70 to 80%? Their estimation is we were 70 to 80% of the chain. There's a range of a suite of investments. There's probably 34 grants in that portfolio. Yes?
I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about your thinking around climate change and adaptation. It seems like that could really undermine a lot of the investments we made in marine as well as other aspects of conservation efforts. And you must be thinking a lot about that.
So we, the reason, one of the reasons we moved from marine spatial planning as opposed to marine protected areas is to try to put it in a more dynamic frame. Once you put a protected area in, you sort of just lock that in. If you've got a fabric there, you think about use zones and plan for it. We think these things might change over time. The reason we're investing in adaptation, we're trying to understand right now what people are thinking about adaptation. So we were going to host a conference, try to get people to come together and talk about what they're doing. And instead, as I said, we made a grant to EcoAdapt, which is a new NGO started by a woman by the name of Laura Hansen, who used to run the adaptation work at WWF. And so she's pulling together those people, and we're doing it in a web-based setting for Vineland Press so that it can be more dynamic. So it is worrisome to us. The one that's really worrisome to us, and we're trying to think through and understand the science of, is ocean acidification. More than anything else, we think that one we're hanging on a lot more work. So we're starting to pay a little bit of attention. Fortunately, our science program is looking at that. Yes?
Sort of fascinated by the word you don't take unsolicited proposals, but you take lots of ideas. Could you expand on where one begins and the other ends, and sort of mechanisms for these, how these things operate?
Sure. Ideas we get out of the literature. We attend conferences. We go to meetings. We talk to a lot of people. An idea is something like, geez, we think we have some skill set, and what you guys, one of the hurdles that's facing in getting catchers adopted is giving people the tool that they need so they can design it to fit their own system. And we noodle over that, and then we go back out and look and see who's got a skill set that might do it. And sometimes, and this might sound like, especially to an academic audience, theft of intellectual property, sometimes the people that come to you with an idea aren't the ones that can carry it out and enable it. So then we go find someone else. Or we're looking at, we're doing this analysis right now of how do we catch up on marine spatial planning. I'm not sure what we're going to find, but I think there's some tools that are going to be needed. And we've, in another frame, supported a network of people that develop tools. And we might pluck some ideas out of that and then go to someone else and say, could you develop this tool for us so we can help us advance marine spatial planning? Does that give you sense?
Sure, I think that's a start.
You're targeting West Coast and BC and New England and using that as a frame to get to the EEZ. And all of the places are near continents, obviously. How do you translate those things into the open ocean? So with respect to fisheries, how do you deal with highly migratory stocks, some of which, of course, are incredibly valuable? Does that help tuna?
We haven't done that yet. We have, but in that area of, so we don't think the catch, so far the way we've addressed the catchers work, it hasn't addressed that. We have looked at, and this might answer your question a little bit better. So we are looking at global fisheries. And global fisheries is $100 billion value, capitalization about $100 billion. Gets about $20 billion in fishing subsidies. And we were approached by WWF a number of years ago to support some policy work around fishing subsidies. And we decided not to do it. We just didn't think that one study could have any impact. But then, shortly after, we watched what was developing in the Doha trade round with WTO. And it turns out because in the Bush administration there were a bunch of free traders that wanted to take down subsidies, we had an opportunity to move on subsidies. So we went and found someone else at WWF who was more campaign oriented. We actually funded work to try to convert subsidies from being negative, having negative impacts, trying to be enhancing. The big risk there for us was that the round wouldn't continue, and in fact it stalled. It didn't collapse, it stalled. It's starting up again, and we might jump back in. So we might have some impact by investing in fishing subsidies. Question next.
Is there a simple answer to the question of how the relationships among foundations with similar missions play out?
Yeah, it's very dysfunctional. So foundations, one of the things that I thought when I was joining the Packard Foundation, I thought, boy, this is great. I don't have to ask for money. And then I just realized I just moved to a different place in the food chain. So I had to ask my board for money and compete with the other initiatives in my foundation to get funding. And the challenge is that all foundations have started their initiatives at different times, and so they all have slightly different focus and slightly different strategies, even if they're all working on marine stuff. So there's a challenge in us syncing up, but we do have a group called the Consultative Group on Biological Diversity, which represents the 55 largest foundations, and they formed working groups, and we have a Marines working group, and one thing that we're trying to do is make sure that we coordinate, so if we see an issue, we can be much more effective working together. Now, having said that it's difficult, there are lots of places where we coordinate. So the Marine Life Protection Act initiative in California has five foundations working to support it. There's another set of activities in the Gulf of California. 3 foundations got together to collaborate. On the catchers work, the Walton Foundation and the Campbell Foundation are big supporters along with us. So we do find ways to partner, but it's not as easy and natural as you might think it should be. Yeah.
I wonder if you and other foundations are thinking about an area that's a lot on my mind, which is the Arctic and climate change. It has a lot of characteristics that sort of fit your 4 filters model, but some of them are really daunting. I think if anybody was seriously going to take on the challenge of the Arctic, you've got to deal in an inherently multinational context, and I wonder, can foundations make a difference in incentivizing 5 countries with very different trajectories and a real lack of any overarching institutional apparatus to do things that we're not going to be able to do much about if we're not part of that.
Right.
Discussion.
So there is an Arctic Funders Group. There's a set of foundations that are focusing on that and thinking about it. Our funds are pretty well committed, and we looked at that and thought, wow, that would be to jump. It's hugely important. To jump into it for us would mean we'd have to shut something else down, and we haven't made that decision. We are hoping that our marine spatial planning framework might be something that we could use into the Arctic, and so if it were to get picked up, then for us as a foundation, we might have a bit more of an incentive to move in that direction. But I don't know the number, but there's a group of 10 or 12 foundations right now that have been thinking about the strategy and looking at the Arctic and trying to get there in advance of it really opening up. So that work is being done.
I like your approach where you indicate your interest in acknowledging the linkage of humans with the natural environment and not wanting to sort of separate humans from places. And I like your notion that you don't want to foster user group conflicts and value conflicts. But in your social ecological system framework, where you obviously want to change human conduct to protect the environment, you probably also want to change human conduct to improve quality of life. And I would imagine that as you do that, you find that user groups and constituencies align with you. Could you say something about successes you might
that we tried to tackle that was, so when you talk about quality of life, we're not actually going into a fishing community, let's say, and if there's displacement, thinking about job retraining or talking about those kinds of things.
Or happy children. Or informed adults.
Yeah, I was thinking about the informed adults. So one of the places we are working, we see that there ought to be a natural affinity for a lot of this work with the recreational fishing community. They've been opponents and worked against some of these issues. So we had one project where it's called Fish Smart, where we partnered with the large sport fishing associations, and we agreed on a fishery. We worked together to develop a management solution that they would find acceptable and would benefit the recreational fishery, but would produce the conservation result. And we took it together to the council, and the council adopted it. But I will have to say, and our hope was that once we did that once, we could tap that conservation ethic that we believe is there in the recreational fishing community and translate it other places. We have not been that successful. Yeah, back.
I think one of the biggest threats to Oregon's oceans is wave energy. I don't know if your foundation's looking at that, but that's coming.
We're not working in Oregon, but we are talking with the foundations that do work there, and they're looking at a territorial use sea plan, as you probably know. And we've been talking to them about thinking about broadening that out and actually making it a full-scale marine spatial plan. In which case, you would look at wave energy, right? And you look at where it might make sense, where it doesn't make sense, what uses it conflicts with. If you were going to create places where you would site it, where would you site it? So in the Massachusetts case, one of the drivers there was wind energy. They wanted to create a series of wind farms, and it was hugely controversial. They ended up deciding on 3 zones. One is a wind energy zone. It's a very small part of their plan, and they have a multiple use zone, and then they have some set of conservation zones. And they lay these out as a mosaic. But they did it by having all of the stakeholders come to the table and put their interest up. They brought the existing data. We helped them build the data layers and take the data that they had and integrate it. So they could look at, in fact, they moved the siting of the wind farms because it wasn't going to make sense for some ecological values. They also moved around some of the multiple use and conservation zones. It's a first cut of the plan. I suspect as they start moving towards implementation, they'll get more and better science and they'll move forward. But one of the things we learned there in that case is the first thing the scientists said, when the governor said 18 months, the scientists said, no way. We don't have the data to do integrated management. That makes it an order of magnitude more complex. And the Secretary for Energy and Environment in Massachusetts said, look, if our data is good enough to do single sector siting and planning, it's good enough to do integrated management, because otherwise we're just going to go forward with a single sector, and we won't. So we took the 80% solution. They took the 80% solution and moved on. It's not by any means a perfect plan. I think it's high marks for most people on doing a lot better than they would have done if they kept moving forward peacefully. I think the same potential is there for Oregon.
In considering the goal of the Marine Conservation Initiative, how will the foundation measure resilience and changes in results?
We're paneling a science advisory board next month to help us think that through. So if you have any thoughts, it's one of those ideas I'd love to think.
Faculty in departments like ours are always making plans and bringing drains to hire new faculty and setting priorities across topical areas. Do you have any impression, based in the program that you run, whether we're missing something that we should prioritize, or ask it another way? If you give us the money, what kind of competition There's land there, apply for fisheries sciences, oceanography. Do you know us well enough to help things?
So the easy answer would be to say I don't know you well enough, right? But I won't cop out. I think the real I think the real place that people have to be investing is in integration. It is, and I don't know whether it's separate programs, I don't know whether it's interdisciplinary degrees, but it is bringing multiple academic foci to one problem and trying to solve it. We're not going to do it. We need to bring the biological, the socioeconomic, and the policy sciences together. So one question I did ask was whether you have joint master's programs with the business school. And I heard no. So one place I think, and if that's true, if you don't have them, one piece of low-hanging fruit I would say would be to start a joint MBA, Master's in Environmental Studies with the business school. Because they're going to bring a certain prerogative and tool set that I think is going to be really important going forward.
We'll be getting right on that later today. Before we do that, I invite you all to come